They believed the convoy would make it through. Japanese naval officers planning Operation 81 in late February of 1943 had calculated the odds carefully. 8 destroyers would escort 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 troops across the Bismarck Sea from Rabaul to Lae. The distance was roughly 250 miles. The voyage would take 3 days, moving at night when possible, hugging the northern coast of New Britain where weather and geography might provide some protection. The troops aboard those transports were desperately needed. The 51st Division, battle-hardened veterans who had fought in China and Manchuria, would reinforce the garrison at Lae on New Guinea's northern coast. Without them, the Japanese position in eastern New Guinea would collapse. With them, the defensive line might hold long enough for Japan to consolidate its positions and force a negotiated peace. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the convoy was spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft approximately 50 miles north of Cape Gloucester. The weather was clearing. The clouds that had provided cover during the night were dissipating. Squadron leader Bill Benn, piloting a B-24 Liberator on patrol from Port Moresby, radioed the sighting at 09:15 hours, 8 large transports, 8 destroyers, heading southeast at approximately 7 knots. At Allied Air Force's headquarters in Port Moresby, General George Kenney received the report within minutes. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. For months, Japanese convoys had slipped through to reinforce their garrisons under cover of weather and darkness. This time, the conditions were different. The skies were clearing. His squadrons were ready. He had modified aircraft specifically for this kind of attack. And most importantly, his pilots had trained in a new technique that Japanese naval officers had never encountered, something that would render conventional anti-aircraft defense almost useless. The Japanese convoy commander aboard the destroyer Shikinami knew Allied aircraft would come. The question was when and in what strength. His anti-aircraft crews were at their stations. His formation was tight, allowing overlapping fields of fire. His ships carried hundreds of 25mm anti-aircraft guns, the Type 96, capable of firing up to 260 rounds per minute at aircraft approaching from medium to high altitude. The doctrine was sound. It had been proven in countless engagements. Aircraft attacking from altitude could be engaged at range, giving gunners time to track targets, establish lead, and bring concentrated fire to bear. Dive bombers were vulnerable during their attack runs, exposed and committed to predictable flight paths. Torpedo bombers had to approach low and slow, perfect targets for massed anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese Navy had shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft using these tactics. But what was about to happen over the Bismarck Sea would not follow the expected pattern. The Allied aircraft approaching that convoy were not coming in at medium altitude. They were not dive bombing. They were not running torpedo approaches. They were coming in at masthead height, at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, with forward-firing guns that would tear ships apart before anti-aircraft crews could properly engage. The Japanese convoy was about to encounter skip bombing and strafing attacks on a scale never before attempted, and the men aboard those transports, packed below decks with their equipment, waiting for the voyage to end, had no idea what was coming. The battle that would unfold in the Bismarck Sea was not an accident of circumstance. It was the culmination of strategic pressures that had been building since Japan's southward advance stalled in mid-1942. After the defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, Japanese forces in the southwest Pacific were stretched thin, holding positions that required constant reinforcement but lacked secure supply lines. Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea, was one of those positions. The town itself was unremarkable, a small settlement that had served as a gold mining centre before the war, but its location made it strategically vital. Lae sat at the base of the Huon Peninsula, controlling approaches to the Markham Valley and the interior of New Guinea. Japanese forces used it as a staging area for operations against Port Moresby and as an anchor for their defensive perimeter protecting Rabaul, the massive base complex on New Britain that served as the hub of Japanese operations in the entire region. By early 1943, the garrison at Lae was in trouble. Allied air attacks had made resupply difficult. The troops there were short of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Disease was rampant in the jungle environment. Combat losses had weakened infantry units. Intelligence reports reaching Japanese headquarters in Rabaul indicated the Australians were preparing an offensive that would overwhelm Lae's defenders unless reinforcements arrived quickly. The Japanese Army's 51st Division was chosen for this mission. These were not raw recruits. The division had fought in the Second Sino-Japanese War, participating in operations in Manchuria and northern China. The men were experienced, disciplined, and accustomed to harsh conditions. Their commander, Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, was confident his troops could hold Lae and possibly push the Allies back if given proper support. The plan called for moving nearly 7,000 men, along with their weapons, ammunition, and supplies, from Rabaul to Lae in a single convoy. 8 transports would carry the troops: the Ayo-maru, Kembu-maru, Kyokusei-maru, Oigawa-maru, Shinai-maru, Taimei-maru, Teo-maru, and Nojima. These were not warships, but converted merchant vessels, cargo ships, and passenger steamers pressed into military service. They were slow, unarmoured, and vulnerable, but they were what Japan had available. 8 destroyers would provide escort: Shikinami, Uranami, Asagumo, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Shirayuki. These were fleet destroyers, fast and heavily armed, capable of defending against surface threats and providing anti-aircraft protection. Each destroyer carried multiple 25mm anti-aircraft guns in twin and triple mounts, along with heavier 12.7cm main guns that could be used against low-flying aircraft. The convoy would depart Rabaul on the evening of February 28, 1943. It would travel at night when possible, seeking protection from Allied air reconnaissance. The route would take it north of New Britain, through the Bismarck Sea, then south along New Guinea's coast to Lae. Japanese planners expected the voyage to take approximately 3 days. They anticipated Allied air attacks but believed the destroyer escort could provide adequate protection. This confidence was based on experience. Japanese naval forces had run similar convoys successfully despite Allied air power. The standard Allied bombing tactics, high-altitude level bombing and medium-altitude attacks by dive bombers and torpedo planes, had proven relatively ineffective against maneuvering ships with strong anti-aircraft defences. Ships could dodge bombs dropped from altitude, and anti-aircraft fire had shot down numerous torpedo bombers before they could release their weapons. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized anti-aircraft defense in depth. Ships in convoy formation would mass their fire, creating a defensive barrier that aircraft had to penetrate. Gunners trained constantly, practicing tracking fast-moving targets and coordinating fire with other ships. The 25mm guns were reasonably effective, with a maximum range of approximately 3,000 meters and the ability to engage aircraft at altitudes up to 1,500 meters. The planners knew Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific were growing stronger. American and Australian squadrons were receiving new aircraft and expanding their bases. But Japanese intelligence had not identified the tactical innovation that Allied commanders had been developing specifically to counter ship convoys. They did not know about the modified aircraft, the specialized training, or the new attack profile that would be used against them. In Port Moresby and at forward bases throughout Papua New Guinea, Allied air crews had been preparing for exactly this kind of target. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had recognized that conventional bombing tactics were inadequate for attacking ships. He had personally overseen the development of skip bombing, a technique where bombs were released at extremely low altitude, causing them to skip across the water like flat stones and strike ships at or near the waterline. He had also ordered aircraft modifications, adding forward-firing machine guns to bombers to suppress anti-aircraft fire during attack runs. The stage was set for a confrontation between conventional naval doctrine and innovative air tactics, between experienced Japanese defenders and aggressive Allied air crews who had trained specifically to destroy convoys. The Japanese convoy, sailing from Rabaul, carried men who trusted their ships and their escorts. The Allied squadrons preparing to attack carried pilots who believed they had finally found a way to sink ships reliably from the air. One side's confidence would be proven catastrophically wrong. The 8 transport ships carrying the 51st Division's troops were not designed for combat. They were merchant vessels, built to carry cargo and passengers in peacetime, now pressed into military service because Japan's purpose-built troop transports had been sunk or were committed elsewhere. Understanding what these ships were, and what they were not, is essential to understanding what happened when Allied aircraft found them. The Ayo Maru, the largest transport in the convoy, displaced approximately 6,900 tons. Built in 1920 as a passenger cargo vessel, she had been requisitioned by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1941. Her hull was riveted steel, typical of merchant construction from that era. She had no armor plating. Her bulkheads were designed to contain cargo, not resist explosions. Below her main deck, troops were packed into holds originally meant for freight, with makeshift bunks and minimal ventilation. The Kembu Maru was smaller, displacing about 5,000 tons. She had been built in Scotland in 1921 and operated as a cargo carrier in civilian service until the war. Her engines were aging, her maximum speed barely 12 knots. She carried approximately 1,000 troops below decks in conditions that would be considered inhumane by any standard. Men slept in shifts because there was not enough space for all of them to lie down simultaneously. Each transport carried not just troops, but also their equipment and supplies. Artillery pieces, machine guns, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, spare parts, all of it packed into holds and lashed to decks. The total cargo across all 8 transports represented months of Japanese production capacity. Ammunition manufactured in arsenals in Japan and transported to Rabaul, food supplies stockpiled through the Empire's strained logistics network, weapons that could not easily be replaced. The destroyer escorts were far more formidable vessels. The Shikinami, flagship of the destroyer squadron, was a Yugure-class destroyer launched in 1937. She displaced 1,680 tons at standard load and could make 34 knots at full speed. Her main armament consisted of 5 12.7-centimeter guns in single turrets, capable of firing 15-kilogram shells at a rate of approximately 10 rounds per minute. For anti-aircraft defense, she mounted 2 twin 25mm gun mounts and additional single mounts, giving her approximately 8 to 12 anti-aircraft guns, depending on her specific configuration. The other destroyers in the escort were similar vessels, all capable of high speed and heavy anti-aircraft fire. The Yukikaze, which would survive the war as one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's luckiest ships, mounted similar armament. The Asagumo and Arashio were slightly older, but equally capable. Together, the 8 destroyers represented a formidable escort force, capable of putting hundreds of rounds per minute into the air against attacking aircraft. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine called for ships to maintain formation, allowing overlapping fields of fire. Each ship's anti-aircraft director would assign sectors, ensuring no gaps existed in coverage. The 25mm guns used tracer ammunition, allowing gunners to observe their fire and adjust. The doctrine emphasized volume of fire over precision, the idea being that enough rounds in the air would inevitably hit attacking aircraft or force them to break off their attacks. This doctrine had worked reasonably well against the attack profiles Japanese naval forces had previously encountered. High-altitude bombers could be engaged at range, giving gunners time to establish tracking solutions. Dive bombers were vulnerable during their attack runs, when they were committed to predictable flight paths. Torpedo bombers had to approach slowly at low altitude to ensure their torpedoes entered the water correctly, making them excellent targets for concentrated anti-aircraft fire. But the attacks being planned by Allied air forces would not follow any of these profiles. The modified aircraft waiting at Port Moresby and forward bases were configured specifically to attack ships at wave-top height, at speeds that would leave Japanese anti-aircraft crews almost no time to react. The B-25 Mitchell medium bombers had been modified with additional forward-firing guns. Standard B-25s carried a single 75mm gun in the nose for ground attack. The modified versions, called commerce destroyers by their crews, carried 8 50-caliber machine guns in the nose, 4 on each side, fixed to fire forward. These guns could pour devastating fire into a ship's superstructure, killing anti-aircraft crews and suppressing defensive fire during the critical seconds of an attack run. The A-20 Boston attack bombers, called Havocs by the Australians, were similarly modified. Fast, maneuverable, and carrying 8 forward-firing 50-caliber guns, they could strafe ships with precision while approaching at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The actual skip bombing technique required specific training and considerable skill. Pilots had practiced for weeks over water targets near Port Moresby, learning to approach at exactly the right altitude, typically between 200 and 300 feet, and at exactly the right speed, fast enough to cross the target quickly, but not so fast as to make aiming impossible. The bombs, typically 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses, would be released at the last possible moment, between 200 and 400 yards from the target. Released at that altitude and speed, the bombs would skip across the water's surface, much like a stone skipped by a child, maintaining forward momentum. If aimed correctly, they would strike the ship at or just below the waterline, where the hull was most vulnerable. The delayed fuse ensured the bomb would penetrate the hull before detonating, creating maximum damage inside the ship, rather than simply blowing a hole in the side. Allied intelligence knew the Japanese transports were unarmored merchant vessels. They knew the destroyers, while formidable, had been designed primarily for surface combat with anti-aircraft capability as a secondary consideration. They knew the ships would be traveling at convoy speed, probably 7 to 10 knots, making them relatively easy targets compared to warships maneuvering at high speed. What Allied planners did not fully appreciate was how devastating their attacks would be. The tactics had been tested in training and in a few small-scale attacks on coastal shipping, but they had never been used against a major convoy with full fighter support and coordinated bomber strikes. The pilots who would fly these missions believed they could sink ships. What they were about to do would exceed even their own expectations. The Japanese troops packed below decks on those 8 transports went, through their daily routines unaware of the tactical innovation being prepared against them. They ate rice and fish, they cleaned their weapons, they talked about what they would do when they reached WWII. Some wrote letters that would never be delivered. They trusted that the destroyers escorting them would protect them from air attack. That trust was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The aircraft that would attack the Japanese convoy were not standard bombers flying standard missions. They were the product of months of experimentation, modification, and training specifically designed to solve a problem that had frustrated Allied commanders since the beginning of the Pacific War: how to sink ships reliably from the air. The Japanese convoy was spotted at 9:15 on the morning of March 3, 1943, by a B-24 Liberator on routine patrol. Squadron leader Bill Benn, piloting the Liberator, maintained distance to avoid alerting the convoy, while his navigator plotted the exact position. The convoy was approximately 50 miles north of Cape Gloucester, steaming southeast at 7 knots. Ben counted 8 large transports and 8 destroyers in a standard defensive formation. The radio message went out immediately. At Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, operations officers began coordinating the attack. The distance from Port Moresby to the convoy's position was approximately 200 miles. Aircraft could reach the target in under 2 hours. Orders went out to every squadron: prepare for immediate launch. This was the target they had been waiting for. At forward airstrips throughout Papua New Guinea, ground crews scrambled to ready aircraft. Pilots grabbed their flight gear and ran to their planes. Engines coughed to life across multiple airfields as bombers and fighters prepared to launch. The coordination required was immense. Squadrons from different bases, flying different aircraft types, had to reach the target area at roughly the same time to execute the planned assault. The first attack came on the afternoon of March 3rd. 8 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers from the 43rd Bomb Group reached the convoy at approximately 1500 hours. These aircraft attacked from high altitude, approximately 7,000 feet, dropping bombs in standard level bombing runs. The Japanese convoy maneuvered violently. Destroyers laid smoke screens. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. None of the bombs hit. This initial attack was not expected to sink ships. Its purpose was to locate the convoy precisely and force it to maneuver, slowing its progress toward Leh. It succeeded in both objectives. The convoy altered course multiple times to avoid bombs. Its speed dropped as ships maneuvered independently, then reformed. Most importantly, the attack confirmed the convoy's position and course for the major assault planned for the following morning. That night, Japanese destroyer crews remained at battle stations. They knew more attacks were coming. Anti-aircraft ammunition was distributed. Guns were checked. Crews tried to rest in shifts, but tension kept many awake. Aboard the transports, troops below decks heard the sound of anti-aircraft fire and felt the ships maneuvering but saw nothing. They remained packed in their holds, in darkness, wondering what was happening above. Weather during the night was poor, with rain squalls and low clouds. The Japanese convoy commander hoped the weather would provide protection, but by dawn on March 4th, the skies were clearing. Visibility was improving. The sea state was moderate, with swells of 3 to 4 feet. Conditions were nearly perfect for low-level air attack. The main assault began at approximately 1000 hours on March 4th. The first aircraft to arrive were Australian Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. 12 aircraft approached at wavetop height from southeast. Japanese lookouts spotted them at perhaps 5 miles distance. Anti-aircraft crews opened fire at maximum range, but the Beaufighters were closing at over 300 miles per hour. The Beaufighters opened fire at approximately 800 yards. Their 20mm cannons and machine guns raked the destroyer's superstructures and the transport's decks. Tracers arced across the water. Explosive cannon shells detonated against steel hulls. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, exposed on deck, were killed or forced to take cover. The Beaufighters flashed past at masthead height, pulling up sharply to avoid the ship's superstructures. Before the Japanese could recover, the B-25 Mitchells arrived. 13 aircraft from the 90th Bomb Squadron, 3rd Attack Group, approached in a loose line-abreast formation. Each aircraft had 8 50 caliber machine guns in its nose. Each carried 4 500-pound bombs with delayed fuses. The B-25s attacked the transports. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners who had survived the Beaufighter strafing attempted to engage, but the volume of fire from the B-25s was overwhelming. 8 guns per aircraft, 13 aircraft firing simultaneously, put over 50,000 rounds per minute into the convoy. Tracers filled the air like a solid wall of fire. Shells tore through ships' superstructures, killed crew members, detonated ready ammunition at gun positions. The bombs were released at approximately 200 yards from target. Pilots could see their bombs leave the aircraft, skip once or twice across the water's surface, then slam into ships' hulls at the waterline. The delayed fuses worked exactly as designed. The bombs penetrated the hulls before detonating. Explosions erupted inside the ships, blowing holes in bulkheads, igniting cargo, killing men packed in holds. The transport Kyokusei Maru took 3 hits in rapid succession. The first bomb exploded in her forward hold, where troops and ammunition were stored. The resulting explosion was massive, blowing out her forward bulkheads and causing the bow to settle rapidly. The second bomb struck amidships, penetrating to the engine room and destroying her machinery. The third bomb hit aft, near the steering gear. Within minutes of being hit, Kyokusei Maru was dead in the water, listing heavily, with fires burning throughout her hull. The trained troops lost in the battle were similarly irreplaceable in the short term. The 51st Division had been an experienced formation. Replacing those men required training new recruits, a process that took months. By the time replacement troops were trained and ready for deployment, the strategic situation had changed. Positions those troops were meant to defend had already fallen. New defensive lines had to be established further back, closer to Japan's core territories. For Allied planners, the success at Bismarck Sea validated the investment in air power and the development of new tactics. General Kenney's 5th Air Force received additional resources and aircraft. Skip bombing techniques were taught to new squadrons arriving in the theatre. The coordination between different aircraft types, fighters, attack aircraft, and bombers, became standard doctrine for anti-shipping operations. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. Japanese soldiers and sailors throughout the Pacific heard about the Bismarck Sea through informal channels, rumors, and letters from survivors. The official reports minimized the disaster, but men in the field knew what had happened. A sense developed among Japanese forces that operating at sea was suicidal if Allied aircraft were present. This affected morale and made assignments to garrisons accessible only by sea particularly dreaded. Allied forces, particularly air crews, gained confidence from the victory. Pilots who had questioned whether skip bombing would work in combat conditions now knew it was devastatingly effective. The success reinforced the belief that Allied material superiority and tactical innovation could overcome any Japanese defensive measures. This confidence would characterize Allied operations for the rest of the war. The battle also demonstrated the vulnerability of unarmored transports to air attack. Japanese merchant vessels, converted passenger ships, and cargo carriers had no defense against bombs and strafing fire. Their crews were civilian sailors pressed into military service, not trained naval personnel. When attacked, they could not maneuver effectively or coordinate defensive fire. They simply burned and sank, taking their cargo and passengers with them. Japanese naval architects and military planners understood this vulnerability, but could do nothing about it. Building armoured transports was not feasible given Japan's industrial capacity and resource constraints. The merchant fleet Japan possessed was the merchant fleet it would fight with, and that fleet was fundamentally inadequate for operating in contested waters under hostile skies. Every convoy operation after the Bismarck Sea was conducted with the understanding that losses would be heavy if Allied aircraft found the ships in daylight. The battle marked a turning point in the Southwest Pacific campaign. Before the Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces could still contest Allied advances, moving troops to threatened positions and maintaining defensive lines. After the Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces were largely on the defensive, unable to reinforce adequately, slowly losing ground as Allied forces advanced from position to position. The strategic initiative had shifted irreversibly. The survivors of the Bismarck Sea convoy carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Men who had spent hours in the water, covered in oil, watching their comrades drown, could never completely process what they had experienced. Japanese military culture did not encourage discussing such trauma. Soldiers were expected to endure, to maintain discipline, to continue serving without complaint. But the memories remained. Those who were rescued by destroyers and returned to Rabaul faced immediate reassignment. There was no time for recovery or rest. The war continued. Men who had nearly drowned one week might find themselves on another ship or in a defensive position the next week. Some survivors were eventually sent to reinforce other garrisons, traveling by submarine or fast destroyer at night, always knowing that daylight might bring the same attacks they had survived once before. A small number of survivors made it to shore on New Guinea or nearby islands, swimming through oil-covered water or clinging to debris that drifted toward land. These men faced different challenges. They were in enemy-controlled territory with no supplies, no support, and no clear way to reach friendly forces. Some were captured by Australian or American troops. Others tried to survive in the jungle, living on whatever they could forage, hoping to eventually reach a Japanese position. Many died of disease, starvation, or exposure before rescue came. Those who were captured provided valuable intelligence to Allied forces. Interrogators learned details about the convoy's composition, its intended destination, and the experience of being under air attack. Some prisoners, particularly after they understood the scale of Allied material superiority, were willing to discuss Japanese tactical doctrines and defensive measures. This intelligence informed future Allied operations and gave insight into Japanese military thinking. One captured officer, a company commander from the 51st Division, described the experience of being below decks when his transport was hit. The first indication was a tremendous explosion, felt more than heard, followed by darkness as the ship's electrical system failed. Water began pouring into the hold almost immediately. Men scrambled toward ladders leading to the weather deck, but the passages were narrow and the crush of bodies made movement nearly impossible. Many men were trampled or pushed aside in the panic. Those who reached the deck found the ship listing severely, with oil fires burning on the water around the hull. The officer survived by jumping into the sea and swimming away from the sinking ship, avoiding the oil fires, and eventually being picked up by a destroyer hours later. His account, recorded by Allied interrogators, reveals the psychological state of men who survived. He described feeling utterly helpless, unable to fight back, unable to see the enemy, unable to do anything except try to survive. This was not how soldiers were supposed to experience combat. Japanese military training emphasized aggression, attacking the enemy, dying honorably if necessary, but always fighting. Being killed passively, drowned in a ship's hold or burned by oil fires, felt wrong at a fundamental level. It violated the warrior code that had been drilled into every soldier from the first day of training. For Allied air crews, the aftermath was different but also complex. Pilots and gunners who had attacked the convoy knew they had killed thousands of men. They had seen ships explode and burn. They had watched men jump into the water. Some had strafed lifeboats and survivors in the water, following orders to prevent enemy troops from reaching shore. These were not easy actions to live with, even for men who understood the military necessity. American and Australian aircrew members spoke about the battle in later years, in interviews and memoirs. Some expressed satisfaction at having contributed to a significant victory. Others were more conflicted. One B-25 pilot described making a strafing run on a transport and seeing men on deck, clearly visible, before his guns opened fire. He knew those men were about to die. He also knew that if they reached Lae, they would fight against Australian and American troops, and Allied soldiers would die. The moral calculation was clear in military terms, but the human reality of what he was doing stayed with him. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea received significant press coverage in the United States and Australia. It was presented as a major victory, evidence that Allied forces were winning the war in the Pacific. General MacArthur's headquarters released information about the battle, including the number of Japanese ships sunk and the estimated casualties inflicted. The coverage emphasized Allied tactical innovation and the effectiveness of skip bombing techniques. It was good news at a time when the public in Allied nations wanted evidence that the war effort was succeeding. Japanese media coverage of the battle was minimal and misleading. Official communiques acknowledged the loss of some transports but minimized the scale of the disaster. The focus was on the heroism of the crews and the survivors, not on the tactical failures or strategic implications. Japanese civilians reading these reports would not have understood that an entire convoy had been destroyed and that Japanese forces in New Guinea were now critically weakened. The disparity between how the two sides reported the battle reflects broader patterns in wartime information management. Allied nations, particularly the United States, had relatively free press systems that reported military victories in detail while being more circumspect about defeats. Japanese media was tightly controlled by the government and military, presenting only information that supported the narrative of inevitable victory and Japanese superiority. Citizens on both sides received filtered information, but the degree of filtering was far greater in Japan. For historians analyzing the battle decades later, The Bismarck Sea represents a clear example of how tactical innovation can produce decisive results. The skip bombing technique, combined with aggressive strafing to suppress defences, solved the problem of how to attack ships effectively from the air. The coordination between different aircraft types maximized effectiveness. The willingness to press attacks despite anti-aircraft fire ensured that enough bombs hit targets to destroy ships. But the battle also illustrates the human cost of war. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died without firing a shot in their own defense. They were victims of strategic decisions made by commanders who did not fully understand the threat Allied air power represented. They were sent to sea in vulnerable ships, without adequate air cover, into waters where the enemy had overwhelming advantage. Their deaths accomplished nothing strategically. The reinforcements never reached Lae. The supplies were lost. The destroyers that might have been used for other missions were sunk or damaged. From a purely military standpoint, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a successful application of air power against naval targets. From a human standpoint, it was a catastrophe in which thousands of men died in circumstances that gave them no chance to fight back or survive. Both perspectives are historically accurate. Both are necessary to understand what happened in those waters between New Britain and New Guinea in early March of 1943. The survivors who lived through the battle and survived the war carried those memories into peacetime. Some spoke about their experiences decades later, when enough time had passed to make discussion possible. Others never spoke about it, keeping those hours in the oil-covered water to themselves. The psychological impact of surviving when so many died, of being helpless under attack, of watching friends and comrades drown, stayed with them for life. The battle might have been over in a few days, but its effects on those who experienced it lasted until the end of their lives. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea established principles that remained relevant long after the specific tactical situation of the Southwest Pacific in 1943 became historical. The most fundamental lesson was that air superiority over sea lanes makes those sea lanes unusable by the side that lacks air cover. This principle, proven at Bismarck Sea, shaped naval thinking for the remainder of World War II and into the post-war era. During the remaining years of the Pacific War, every major amphibious operation, whether conducted by Allied or Japanese forces, included comprehensive planning for air superiority. The United States Navy's fast carrier task forces, which dominated the Pacific from mid-1944 onward, existed primarily to establish and maintain air superiority over areas where amphibious landings or convoy operations were planned. The Japanese Navy's attempts to contest Allied advances without adequate air cover consistently failed, culminating in disasters like the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where Japanese carrier aviation was effectively destroyed. The skip bombing technique pioneered by General Kenney's air forces was studied and refined throughout the war. It was used against Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific theater. Other Allied air forces adapted similar low-level bombing techniques for use in different theaters. British and American aircraft in the Mediterranean used variants of skip bombing against German and Italian ships. The principle of approaching at wave-top height to minimize the time available for defensive fire became standard doctrine for anti-shipping strikes. The broader lesson about material superiority versus fighting spirit also resonated beyond the specific context of the Bismarck Sea. Japanese military doctrine throughout the war emphasized spiritual strength, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice as compensating factors for material disadvantages. This doctrine was not entirely wrong. Well-trained, motivated troops with adequate equipment can defeat larger forces with poor training or low morale. But there are limits. When material disadvantages become overwhelming, when the enemy has 10 times as many aircraft or ships or tanks, spiritual strength becomes irrelevant. Japanese soldiers and sailors throughout the Pacific experienced versions of what the Bismarck Sea convoy survivors experienced. They were ordered to hold positions that could not be adequately supplied. They were told to fight with equipment that was obsolete or insufficient. They were assured that fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages. and repeatedly, they discovered this was not true. American forces, with their overwhelming numbers of ships and aircraft and vehicles, supported by an industrial base that produced war material at rates Japan could never match, simply crushed Japanese defensive positions through sheer weight of firepower. This does not diminish the courage or skill of Japanese forces. Many battles in the Pacific were hard fought. Japanese defensive tactics, particularly in the war's later stages, inflicted heavy casualties on attacking American forces. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated that even with overwhelming material superiority, Allied forces paid a high price for victory. But the outcome was never in doubt. Once Allied forces committed sufficient resources, Japanese positions fell. The timeline might be longer than expected, the casualties higher, but the result was predetermined by the material imbalance. For military historians and strategists studying the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea serves as a case study in several areas. It demonstrates the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. The convoy was located and tracked by Allied patrol aircraft, allowing the concentration of forces necessary for decisive attack. It shows the value of tactical innovation, with skip bombing proving far more effective than conventional bombing techniques. It illustrates the need for combined arms coordination, with fighters, attack aircraft, and bombers all playing essential roles in the successful attack. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates the consequences of strategic overreach. Japan in 1943 was attempting to hold defensive positions across an enormous area, from Burma to the Central Pacific to the Solomons. This required constant movement of troops and supplies across sea lanes that Allied air and naval forces increasingly dominated. The decision to send the convoy to Leh was based on military necessity. The garrison there genuinely needed reinforcements, but it was also a decision made without adequate consideration of whether the convoy could actually survive the voyage. Japanese planners hoped the convoy would get through. Hope is not a strategy. The men who died in the Bismarck Sea were victims of strategic decisions made without full understanding of the operational environment. Their commanders knew Allied air power was strong, but underestimated its effectiveness and overestimated their own defensive capabilities. The result was predictable in retrospect. An unarmoured, slow-moving convoy, attacked by hundreds of aircraft with advanced tactics designed specifically to sink ships, would be destroyed. But that prediction requires knowledge of all factors, knowledge Japanese planners did not fully possess. In the end, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of the decisive actions in the Southwest Pacific campaign. It did not end the war. It did not change the ultimate outcome, which was determined by the massive material advantage Allied nations held. But it accelerated the timeline of Allied advance, weakened Japanese defensive positions throughout New Guinea, and demonstrated that Japanese forces could not maintain their positions without secure sea communications. Those sea communications could not be secured against Allied air attack. Therefore, Japanese positions would fall, one after another, as Allied forces advanced. The convoy that left Rabaul on the evening of February 28, 1943, carried 7,000 soldiers who believed they were going to reinforce a defensive position. They trusted their ships. They trusted their escort. They believed their military's assurances that the convoy would make it through. By March 5th, most of them were dead, killed not in ground combat but in ships burning and sinking under air attack they could not defend against. Their deaths illustrated a fundamental truth about modern industrial warfare. Wars between major industrial powers are ultimately won by the side that can produce more weapons, more ships, more aircraft, more ammunition, and can deliver that material to the battlefield effectively. Individual courage, tactical skill, and operational competence matter, but they cannot overcome sustained material disadvantage. The Japanese soldiers aboard those transports were as brave, as disciplined, as willing to fight as any soldiers in any army. But they were sent to sea in vulnerable ships without adequate protection, and they died as a result of strategic decisions beyond their control. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over in 3 days. Its consequences shaped the remainder of the Pacific War. The tactical lessons influenced anti-shipping operations for decades. But for the men who were there, whether attacking or being attacked, it was an experience that defined their understanding of war. Those who survived carried those memories for life. Those who died left behind families who would receive vague notifications about deaths in service without details about how or where. The battle was a victory for Allied forces and a disaster for Japan. But underlying the strategic outcome was human tragedy on a scale that statistics cannot capture. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.